I think we need to push back on this. There's no guarantee to free speech on misinformation or hate speech, and especially around our democracy.
And now let's talk more about the new Democratic vice presidential nominee, Tim Walz, the pretty radically progressive governor of Minnesota, who's coming under some serious scrutiny right now, with people digging up stuff from his past, including one disturbing clip where he talks about free speech and doesn't seem to understand the First Amendment. This is an interview clip from MSNBC last year. Let's take a listen.
Years ago, it was the little things, telling people to vote the day after the election, and we kind of brushed them off. Now we know it's intimidation at the ballot box. Mm-hmm. It's undermining the idea that mail-in ballots aren't legal. I think we need to push back on this. There's no guarantee to free speech on misinformation or hate speech, and especially around our democracy. Tell the truth where the voting places are, who can vote, who's able to be there. And
So I wanted to play this in part because a lot of conservatives and Republicans are sharing the super short clip of this, totally stripped of the context, just the part where he says that misinformation and hate speech aren't protected by the First Amendment.
I think we need to push back on this. There's no guarantee to free speech on misinformation or hate speech, and especially around our democracy.
And I wanted to include the full context because when you do, the remarks aren't as bad as they sound stripped of the context. They're still bad in my view, but they're not as bad. Because it is true, and they were discussing election-related stuff, that it is a crime to lie or spread false information about elections in a certain sense. So like, for example, if the election is on November 5th, you cannot go out there and actively tell people it's on November 7th, because that's viewed not just as speech that's inaccurate, but as actions that are depriving someone else of their rights, which is their right to vote, by a form of fraud. So in a very narrow sense, he's correct, and some Republicans are framing this clip disingenuously. But it's still crazy how he kind of threw out in there like, oh, well, and misinformation and hate speech aren't protected by the First Amendment. Like, no, that's not accurate. To say that in an extremely narrow context, election lies are criminalized is true, but generally speaking, misinformation is free speech, is protected by the First Amendment, and hate speech, throwing that in there, I have no idea what he was doing or talking about, because there's zero extent to which hate speech is not protected by the First Amendment. It unequivocally is. So while I do think he's being hit somewhat unfairly with this snippet, it's still kind of concerning to me to see somebody who's risen so high in our politics as a governor of a state and now a vice presidential nominee illustrate a profound lack of understanding about the First Amendment and how it works, and just casually toss out, name exemptions to free speech and the First Amendment that don't actually exist. So I do think there's a fair criticism to be made of Tim Walz from this clip, although I think Republicans are being disingenuous with stripping it of the context. So I will point that out. But this guy, Tim Walz, is very much a radical, and there's so much fertile ground to go after him on his positions and his handling as governor of the insane 2020 BLM riots in Minneapolis and elsewhere in Minnesota, where people were killed, businesses were destroyed, communities were ruined, and he waited days to send in the National Guard. There's so much to go after him. His radical views on things like LGBT issues and giving kids sex changes, his pro-tax stuff where he's increased taxes a ton in his state. Like, there's so much fertile ground to go after this guy on. But conservative media is instead doing some kind of silly attacks on him, like this one from Jesse Waters over at Fox News.
Here's Twitchy Tim on stage, waving profusely in a very unsettling manner. Very unsettling. Men should not move this way. It's not the way we move. And the handshake is probably the most telling. This is Walz and his wife shaking hands like business associates, followed by a weird hug. Now let's compare that to Walz's interaction with Kamala's husband, Doug. Interesting. What's going on here?
Wow. Sorry, but I think this is juvenile and dumb. Twitchy Tim, really? That's the level of discourse we're going with, the substantive criticism of the Democrats' vice presidential nominee. And like, was his wave slightly awkward or a little bit odd looking? Maybe, but I don't think it was very unsettling. This seems to be a real reach, a real stretch worthy of an Olympic gold for the mental gymnastics going on here. And was he kind of awkward, like shaking his wife's hand on stage like that? Yeah, kind of, but I just doubt he's probably very new to this kind of campaigning, right? A presidential campaign on stage like this. It's probably just more a lack of familiarity with the situation than anything else. And my whole thing is, whenever Republicans are making this kind of attack on Tim Walz or Kamala Harris or whatever, they're losing, because no normal American cares about whether he waves slightly awkwardly. They care about the actual issues that affect them and the people in their community, some of which he has some very bad and radical ideas about that you should be talking about instead. Also, I've just got to say, the cheap shot about, oh, look, he hugged the second gentleman, Doug, the Kamala's husband, he must be gay. Obviously, that's what's implied there. It's just stupid. It's just lame. It's baseless. It's juvenile. I just hope Republicans and conservative media can focus on more substantive criticism, because this is not going to land well with anybody outside of the hardcore base that you've already got fully on your side. And if you want to actually speak to the American people effectively, you've got to do a more substantive approach than twitchy Tim. Okay?